Now for today's program. Harry Castleman is a lawyer specializing in business, real estate, probate, and intellectual property law. He has co-authored 9 popular culture books with Walter Podrazik, focusing on the history of television and the Beatles. He previously worked as a media producer for the Democratic National Committee, press secretary for the Florida Democratic Party, and as a media consultant for political campaigns both nationally and in Florida. Harry has been a guest lecturer on TV history at Boston University's College of Communication and has been interviewed on radio and television stations concerning television and music history. Walter J Pedrajek is a respected television historian, analyst, and media planner. He is an adjunct lecturer at the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he has taught courses on future TV, television history, and the intersection of mass media and politics. Walter has experienced firsthand history in the making, handling media logistics at such high-profile events as the Democratic Party's quadrennial presidential nominating conventions and as part of both inaugurals of President Bill Clinton. Walter is co-author of 10 books, 9 of them with Harry Castleman, including the television history Watching TV. Walter was among the on-camera expert voices in the CNN Decades miniseries, the 90s and the 2000s. Walter is a member of the board of directors of the Library of American Broadcasting Foundation and serves as a television curator at the Museum of Broadcast Communications in Chicago. Please welcome Harry Castleman and Walter Podrazik.
Hello.
Here we are. What we'd like to do is thank you very much for having us and dive right into probably the number one question that we get, which is, when was the golden age of television? Now, that's a description, it turns out, that can be applied to many eras. But whether you want to call it a golden age or just a great time to tune in, one era we like to point to is the mid-1960s, 1965, 1966, 1967. Viewers at that time were offered a veritable tube of plenty. You could find already established favorites like Walter Cronkite, Ed Sullivan, and Walt Disney. There were fresh offerings then, like Star Trek, The Monkees, and The Wild Wild West. There was exhilarating coverage of space flights and sober reporting on overseas and domestic conflicts. Most of this was carried by 3 commercial broadcast networks. That's the way it was, and most viewers never gave that fact a second thought. Yet television in the mid-1960s was still young enough so that the founders of these companies were still around. David Sarnoff, William Paley, Leonard Goldenson, they could see what their visions had led to. NBC, CBS, ABC. But where did even the concept of networks come from? To answer that question, you have to go back before TV.
It's not exactly a state secret that a lot of the old Hollywood movie moguls were Jews. That's well known. It's not quite as well known that the originators of the 3 commercial networks in the US were also Jewish. And that's who we're going to focus on at this beginning part of our talk. And you have to begin that discussion with David Sarnoff, who was the man behind RCA and NBC. His story is really a classic first-generation immigrant story. Not just Jewish immigrant, but many kinds of ethnic groups. It turns out he was Jewish, of course, but his story really reads like out of a Horatio Alger story. He comes to the country with nothing, winds up becoming one of the most powerful people in the country, or at least certainly in the broadcast field. He had that fire in his belly to get out of poverty that really you see in a lot of the first generation immigrants. He was not an inventor. He was not a producer, director, writer, actor, anything. He was a businessman. He was a visionary. He was also somewhat of a bully too, but sometimes that goes together. I mean, his background is fascinating. He was born at the end of the 19th century in the Pale of Settlement in what is now Belarus, close to Minsk. It's the same story you've heard before. He was a young boy. His father leaves the family to come over to the United States to earn some money. Young David's over there in Minsk, in the area, and he's going to Cheder with all the other Jewish boys, where his granduncle is the rabbi teaching. And then finally, the father sends for the rest of the family. They come over to the United States, to New York. They're living in New York. He has to, learn English and so forth. He's going to school, gets up to the 8th grade. And then his father gets tuberculosis, can't work anymore. And so David, with some of the other kids, winds up having to go out and find a job to support the family. So what does he do? He gets a job at a telegraph company, not Western Union, but something like Western Union. He's an office boy doing little tasks. Well, the fall comes, it's Rosh Hashanah. He asks to have Rosh Hashanah off with pay. They say, no thanks. He says, see you later. He proverbially crosses the street, goes to work for another telegraph company, the American Marconi Company, started by Guillermo Marconi, the man who sort of invented telegraphs a little earlier. This is the American branch. He becomes an office boy there. He's hired for $5.50 a week, starts work on September 30th, 1906, and he stays there at that company for 65 years and winds up becoming the top man at the company. He rises quickly, learns about telegraphy, which was the way it worked then. It was telegraphs like you think of. It was point to point, one person sending a telegraph to somebody else. That's it. And over time, he gets to realize the power of mass communication that's possible through telegraphy and other forms. And there were beginning to be people who were experimenting in broadcasting voice, not just dots and dashes. He thinks that's a fascinating idea. And as he's moved up a little bit in the company, he's become sort of a middle-level executive. He proposes what he calls radio music boxes. He suggests the idea that the company get in the business of selling radios, what we call radios, and broadcasting entertainment programs. The company thinks this is a crazy idea. It's not going to work. It won't make any money. They like doing just private telegrams. Well, it gets to be around 1920. Other companies are getting interested in what Sarnoff is suggesting. Westinghouse, another big company, starts what is generally called the first real radio station in the US, KDKA in Pittsburgh. And then the American Marconi Company is bought by General Electric and becomes RCA. Sarnoff is now a general manager and suggests, again, hey, we ought to get into this radio business. And so eventually they do. And he's the one with the visionary thing of saying, let's do this. Let's have radio stations around the country that will broadcast the programs that we generate and use sponsors to pay for it. He wasn't the first person to come up with this idea, but he's the person who made it happen, which is an entirely different matter. And so sure enough, by 1926, NBC goes on as the first US radio network. There were actually two NBC networks, the Red Network and the Blue Network. The Red Network was kind of like the major leagues for NBC. The Blue Network was sort of the minor leagues, where programs that might not do as well or were just starting out, and they have different stations and so forth. But it's NBC is all there is. And of course, they start doing very well. They eventually get some competition, which we'll get to with Bill Paley. But meanwhile, NBC, which is the first, is the top dog in the radio world. And RCA is selling radios to people, makes money that way. They are running their two networks, Red and Blue. They are making money that way through their sponsors. And But the problem is, of course, it's AM radio that we're talking about. And as you recall, AM radio has a lot of static, particularly at night or the station gets far away. And they were trying to find some way to fix that problem. And there's an inventor, Edwin Armstrong, comes up with an idea which we now know is FM radio. And Sarnoff hires him. He wants Armstrong to help get rid of this static problem. Armstrong has already gotten patents for FM radio, and he tells Sarnoff, no, if we do this, you've got to get rid of all the AM stations you've got. Sarnoff says that's a crazy idea. We've got too much invested in the AM stations, and what we've got, forget it. So he ties up Armstrong for years in patent litigation, and FM, as we might know, really doesn't become popular until the 50s. But Sarnoff has his way in the long run, is that AM was the primary source of radios for the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s.
And one of the things that's important to inject right here is, Harry, you said, of course, they make money. Well, it wasn't necessarily an of course. The question that Sarnoff was able to deal with quite effectively was the business side. I'm going to own these patents. I'm going to set up this system. I'm going to build the stage. But in point of fact, for people who came to love radio, not just incorporate that into their lives, but to really love it, it was the people on the stage that made the difference. And since NBC had the biggest stage, certainly out of the box, they had the biggest stars. The fascinating thing about radio is that it did two things with its programming. If you are already an established name, even a little bit established, it would enhance you. And so a lot of the early performers drew on a vaudeville background. So people would not necessarily know them very well because they had seen them in a mass medium setting, but they would know them because they might have seen them on stage, or mom might have seen them on stage or something like that. But the next step was radio brought them onto a bigger stage. And so someone who had been a top draw in the vaudeville circuit turns out to have even a bigger reach on radio. And you can see the great affection for radio among some of those early stars. If you think of people like a Bing Crosby or a Bob Hope or a Jack Benny, inevitably they will have, well, remember the old days, and then there would be a skit sort of recreating vaudeville. It was an idealized skit, clearly, but it was also born of the fact that that's where they came up, and that's where they helped to establish and hone their talents. So they would be elevated by being on radio. The other type of star that emerged would be created by radio. And so someone like Jim and Marion Jordan, Fibber McGee and Molly, would listen. They were listening to the radio in Chicago and said, I could do that. In fact, we could do it better. And so they came in, and they also became radio stars, superstars over the long run. And it was because radio shared their unique sense of humor on a stage that was far bigger than you can reach going from town to town, theater to theater. And at the same time, there were also movies emerging. Feature films reinforced all of this. So someone like a Bob Hope would, I think starting around 1938 or so, he was turning out like 2 movies a year at least. And so you had radio being the way that you can hear the star that you had just seen in the latest film, or it could be that the film was where you got to see the radio voice that you'd become so familiar with. So all of this helped to build radio in conjunction with films, and in conjunction still with some stage shows, basically establishing the popular culture assumptions for an entire country.
And of course, one of the people who really was created by radio, who was not known at all beforehand, was Gertrude Berg, who went to NBC in, I think it was like 1929, and said, I think again, the same story. I think her husband lost his job or something like that. And she decided that she was going to go ahead and try to earn some money for the family. And so created the Goldbergs, which was sort of a loosely based version of her and her family and the people she knew, all Jewish immigrants living in New York, and their trials and tribulations and the humor that went along with it. And that began on NBC, on the Blue network, the lower ranked network that NBC had. And very quickly, it became very popular. And the amazing thing is that because originally the network thought, well, this is probably not going to be too successful, they kind of said, okay, you know, Mrs. Berg, you can do this show, but you have to take care of all the costs and the expenses and so forth. And so she got to keep the ownership of the program. And consequently, she became one of the first really successful people from radio who created their own industry just from their own life. And the Goldbergs, as we'll discuss, lasted a very long time. It was on the radio forever and even made it over onto TV. Speaking of TV, so you've got NBC is doing very well on radio, but Sarnoff, that wasn't enough for him. He was also fascinated by any other form of communication that could be popular and be successful and could help RCA sell products. And there had been experiments in television during the mid-20s. And Sarnoff was one of the, again, just like in radio, he had been one of the early backers of television. By this time, he was high enough up in RCA that they actually began to listen to him. And NBC was one of the first big companies to get involved in early television. And with the help of another Russian emigre, Vladimir Zworykin, who was not Jewish, who was the inventor of one aspect that became the electronic television we knew and loved up till the digital age recently. NBC was one of the first to launch a electronic television service in the late 30s. And there, of course, just like with the FM thing I told about, there was also some legal issues. And I think Wally knows about that.
Right, and in particular, the quest was to find an electronic television system that would work. And so you had this team working for RCA, dedicated to, we're going to get this breakthrough, because of course, it wasn't just pride of inventing achievement, it was ownership, it was licensing, it was to create the thing that everyone else would want to use. And they discovered that someone beat them to it. Philo Farnsworth. I love the fact that here you have the farm boy who comes in without all of this backing. He certainly had backers, but it was not the corporate giant coming up with it. And he invented electronic television. Sarnoff wanted to buy him out, basically, and he said no. And so there ensued a battle, a patent battle. And the odd thing is, Farnsworth won, but Sarnoff ultimately won, because he knew all the tricks of postponing and appealing and what have you. But it's still a fascinating story, because in that sense, you see the essence of Sarnoff as the business visionary, and you have the essence of the inventor visionary clashing. We're all familiar with Aaron Sorkin from West Wing and such. Well, he did a wonderful play called The Farnsworth Invention. And I don't think there's any other person in television media history that had, in those early days, that would quite fit the bill the way David Sarnoff did. He was the antagonist of that story. And it's not that he was evil. It's just that he had his goal and Farnsworth had his goal, and the two of them clashed, and it was quite dramatic. And in the case of Farnsworth, he became a footnote. He was on What's My Line once. I think it was either What's My Line or I've Got a Secret. It doesn't matter, because his secret was, I invented television. And the audience goes, oh, really? Say what?
I think the comparison there might be the famous quote attributed to Joseph Stalin about the Pope. And he says, "Oh, how many divisions does the Pope have?" Philo Farnsworth didn't have any divisions. David Sarnoff did. And in fact, speaking of military, of course, when World War II comes along, all of the American media industry gets involved in the war project. David Sarnoff goes off, is helping the military, working for the military over in London with the US informational services, working with General Eisenhower's staff. And by the end of the war, Sarnoff had been promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. And that was the greatest honor that he ever had. And he loved it. He loved to be seen wearing his general's hat. And for the rest of his life, not only was he known as the general, but that's what everybody who worked for him called him. That's what the press called him. He was the general. He loved that because in RCA, he was the general. And so he was in charge of everything they did.
And that was the journey. He had come, the poor boy from across the sea comes in, and he's the general in charge of everything. Very proud of being able to wear that title. He wore the title proudly.
But as I say, NBC did have competition. The competition was CBS. And the person behind CBS was William Paley, who was a classic second generation immigrant. He grew up in a much more affluent, refined world and was more at home in the world of culture than the rough diamond of David Sarnoff. He was born in Chicago right at the start of the 20th century. His father was a Jewish immigrant from the Ukraine. His father worked in a cigar factory, but was pretty sharp. And by the 1920s, the father, Sam, had his own cigar factory and had become a millionaire. The father moves the family to Philadelphia, and they're doing very well. Bill Paley goes to Wharton School of Management, Wharton School of Finance at the University of Pennsylvania, and goes to work in the family business in the cigar factory, in the cigar company, and winds up becoming rich on his own right. Meanwhile, CBS had been launched as a network very soon after NBC, but it was on a shoestring budget and was failing almost immediately for lack of funds, lack of sponsors, lack of affiliates. And so the Sam Paley and two relatives, Isaac and Leon Levy, who owned WCAU in Philadelphia, they purchase CBS and Sam says to his son, Bill, let you run it. You can take care of that. And so at the age of 27, Bill Paley becomes the president of CBS and is soon the majority stockholder, which he stayed for a long period of time. And Bill Paley took this floundering network and within a relatively short time, in the middle of the Depression, mind you, winds up turning it into a very strong competitor to NBC. How did he do that? Well, he was very good at dealing with the local radio affiliates, dealing with the sponsors. NBC was kind of known as somewhat heavy-handed in their dealings with those. Paley, whose cigar company had been a radio sponsor, understood their point of view and was a little more open to them. He also was an excellent judge of talent. He is known as he had the eye for what was good. There was a great quote about Bill Paley from David Halberstam, who says that Bill Paley knew what was good and would sell. He knew what was bad and would sell. And he knew what was good and would not sell. And he never confused one with the other. And that kind of guided his career through CBS. NBC, as we discussed, was really kind of focusing more on variety, comedy variety, musical variety. CBS is trying to go in a different direction. They kind of focus more on comedy. They're the ones who are largely responsible for Jack Benny and Burns and Allen. They steal the Goldbergs from the NBC Blue Network in the mid-30s. At that time, there really weren't many news divisions. The networks didn't really do news as we know it. CBS and Bill Paley get behind forming their own news division in the late 30s and winds up hiring Edwin R. Murrow, who of course becomes famous during World War II, reporting on the spot, on the scene over in London. And so by the time the war comes along, CBS is a very strong competitor of CBS, but still number 2. Paley gets involved in the war effort just like Sarnoff did. He's over in London with the military. He only got up to be a colonel, and nobody ever called him the colonel. He was just Bill Paley. After the war, television gets going again. It had been dead during the World War II. NBC immediately jumps out ahead, as they had done on the radio. They've got Milton Berle doing the first big major TV variety show. And CBS was kind of holding back. They weren't sure about technical reasons of what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. And they let NBC kind of take the lead. And by the time CBS finally jumps into the game, once again, as in radio, they're playing in the number 2 slot. NBC has all these live, big comedy variety, musical variety shows. What's CBS going to do? Sitcoms. They have the Goldbergs. And then they try everything was live back then. Most everything was live. Things that were done on film were minor items. And CBS decides to go with a show called I Love Lucy.
The way that evolved was, at first, CBS is saying, we want to put Lucille Ball into a vehicle because she had been successful for them on radio with something called My Favorite Husband. And so Lucy says, well, we don't, first of all, I want to do this with my real life husband. For personal reasons, we want to spend more time together. Band leader Desi Arnaz is spending a lot of time on the road. Lucy, besides radio, had an okay career on sort of a second string in feature films. So she would always be like the third person in the tale. She wouldn't be necessarily the lead. But they said, well, we want to do a TV series together, but we don't want to leave California and go to New York and do something live. We want to do it on film. And CBS, film? No. Well, okay, kind of like with with Gertrude Berg. All right, you want to do it, you pay for it. And so Lucy and Desi did, and they owned it. And if Molly Goldberg's character with Gertrude Berg became a valuable asset from the radio, transitioning into feature films, transitioning onto stage, transitioning eventually into TV. Well, the I Love Lucy set topped that in every way imaginable. And in fact, I Love Lucy ended up defining what would be considered the success in this new medium. NBC said live variety, live music, live comedy variety, live performance. And CBS said, we have some of that. We have the Ed Sullivan, we have those. But you know what's really working? What's really working is this filmed situation comedy, which became, without question, the most successful entry of early television, and as we all know, still playing today.
And CBS also was known, and under the guidance or the overview of Bill Paley, it always found time for more high-class cultural type programming. When you look back on it now, you remember things like Studio One, Playhouse 90, the great TV dramas of the so-called Golden Age in the 50s. They also, at that time, they weren't doing NFL on Sunday afternoons. That was on the minor league Dumont network. And so CBS and Sunday afternoon had what was called the Sunday afternoon egghead slot, where they would put in things like Edward R. Murrow's See It Now, or Omnibus, or Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concert. And that was the, you know, the prestige programming that Bill Paley really felt obligated to do, because that's what a man of quality does. He likes to, he's not just there making money, he wants to give back. Now, of course, he's making a lot of money, but he had the ability and the status and the success to be able to do some of these quality programming in the less important time slots. And by the time that CBS gets the NFL in the mid-50s, and the time that live drama is going off and being replaced by more filmed sitcoms and so forth, CBS finally takes over as #1. And from 1955 to 1976, CBS was the top network in the United States. They were called the Tiffany Network because they were tops in prime time, they were tops in daytime, they had, the quality programming, and it was considered the gold standard of the time of television. And, so Paley winds up being the head of this very successful network, finally tops his rival, Mr. Sarnoff. But there's another network. That's ABC. Well, where did they come from? Well, they came from the Blue Network of NBC. When in the 40s, the government made NBC sell off its Blue Network, and was bought by the owner of Lifesavers, changed its name to the ABC Network, and promptly became a complete failure. They didn't have many affiliates. They didn't have many people watching it. They didn't have any hits. They were about to go under in the early 50s. In comes Leonard Goldenson. Leonard Goldenson isn't as well known as Sarnoff and Paley. He's not as so much affected by the immigrant experience, but like the other two, he revolutionized how TV worked and arranged for the final consummation of the marriage of TV and Hollywood. He was born in a little town 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. His family was one of only 4 Jewish families in this town. His father owned a clothing store and owned an interest in the local movie theater, which is where Goldenson starts working as a young boy. The family wasn't that wealthy, but yet he goes to Harvard undergraduate, Harvard Law School, and gets hired after Harvard Law by Paramount Pictures, one of the big Hollywood movie studios, in their legal department. At that time, the movie studios all owned their own movie theaters. They made the films and they also showed them in their own theaters. That's why there are so many old movie theaters called the Paramount. But again, the government forces the movie theaters to get rid of their movie theaters. They just focus on producing films. So the Paramount theaters are spun off into a different company. Goldenson goes with them. And he's now thinking, okay, there's this new thing coming up, TV. Everyone's doing it. Most Hollywood studios wanted nothing to do with television. That was like the enemy. That was poison that was going to kill their box office, which it was doing. But Goldenson, his visionary aspect of this was seeing that Hollywood and television were not really enemies. They could be partners. They could each make money for each other. And so when ABC is completely almost bankrupt, he arranges for the United Paramount Theater Company to purchase ABC in 1953 for $25 million. The network, they only had 2 hits. They had The Lone Ranger and Ozzie and Harriet, which were also on film, interestingly enough. And so he's thinking, okay, how can we get Hollywood and TV together? As I say, the studios want nothing to do with it. The first person he talks into going along with him, Walt Disney.
And the thing about, Walt Disney,
what's that?
The thing about Walt Disney is he wasn't one of the major studios at that time. That is, you come in and say, all right, Walt Disney had his own vision. He wanted to build Disneyland. And so this was a perfect marriage of you can help me and I can help you, because the name of the anthology show that ABC lands from Disney was called Disneyland. And it was divided into, 1 week it would be Frontierland, and 1 week it would be Fantasyland, 1 week it would be Adventureland. By the most amazing of coincidences, just what the aborting Disneyland park was being designed around.
And don't forget, Wally, he was also inserting fascinating previews of the latest Disney film. just in case you wanted to know.
And in fact, let's do a behind the scenes of the latest Disney film. Let's show some of the special underwater effects. Let's show the submarine. Let's show how we do these things, which you can only see in your local theater when you tune in, when you pay your box office admission and see this latest Disney offering.
So ABC, which was doing very poorly, gets Walt Disney to do Disneyland, a 1-hour show on ABC, and it becomes a hit. Okay, that's great, but that's just 1 hour. What else is ABC going to do? Well, okay, with the success of Disneyland and how Walt Disney is using TV to help his film studios business and his theme park business, Leonard Goldenson goes to Jack Warner of Warner Brothers and says, look, see what Disney's doing? Why don't you guys do the same thing? He has a 4.5-hour dinner with Jack Warner in Hollywood and talks Jack Warner into signing on to do a show on ABC, or Warner Brothers doing a show. It's called Warner Brothers Presents. There are going to be 3 rotating series, 2 of which are based on old hit Warner Brothers films. There was Casablanca, which we all know, King's Row with that originally had been with Ronald Reagan, and they also do an original series called Cheyenne, a Western. Well, the Casablanca and King's Row TV version go down the drain pretty quickly. Cheyenne becomes a hit. And it just so happens that's at the beginning of where TV Westerns, which of course are filmed because they're in the great outdoors. And Cheyenne becomes a hit, and Warner Brothers says, hey, this is pretty good. What comes next? Maverick, Sugarfoot, Colt 45, Bronco, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty soon, all the networks are doing filmed Westerns. There's like, the TV is overflowing in TV Westerns by the late 50s. They get a little tired of that. Warner Brothers says, let's kind of take Westerns and make Westerns that aren't Westerns. And they call them action adventure shows. What were they? 77 Sunset Strip, Bourbon Street Beat, Hawaiian Eye, The Alaskans. By 1959, Warner Brothers is producing 1/3 of ABC's entire primetime schedule. So, you know, that was Hollywood suddenly discovered TV is not so bad after all. And Leonard Goldenson was the man behind all that. And ABC didn't just do, film series and Westerns. They also focused on young viewers, which CBS and NBC weren't focusing on so much. Of course, they had Disneyland. They had the Mickey Mouse Club during the day. They did American Bandstand during the day. They also did cartoons, Flintstones, Top Cat, Bugs Bunny, and eventually in the mid-60s, where Wally was started with, Batman, and also Shindig. And they did sports. They were doing Wide World of Sports, and they did the old American Football League when they started. They focused on the Olympics when nobody was paying much attention to them, and they, of course, brought football to primetime with Monday Night Football.
And the thing that ABC and then eventually the other 2 networks embraced was this not only is a money machine, television is not only a money machine, but it is something that is of the widest possible interest to people. That is, let's have fun doing sports. Let's have fun with drama, and let's basically now deal with television as a given in terms of entertainment. I was talking once with Michael Nesmith, famous of the Monkees, and he said in the era that the Monkees came around, TV was in its teens, it's its upper teens. It was about 16, 17, 18, if you count 1950 is when it all starts. And he said, yeah, that made sense. We were looking at television and television production, not as an extension of radio, not as an extension of the movies, but as its own self-referential medium. And Goldenson was definitely the one who pushed that view. So you start having things like movie of the week, an original movie of the week. That didn't mean that we've gotten a movie that first played in the theaters and now television gets it 3 years later, 5 years later, whatever. No, we're cutting all that out. We're making an original right now. And we are offering you an ABC original film. And so that vision of how television worked ends up being the one that stuck. And to varying degrees, each of the networks reflected the personalities of the founders.
Yes.
But the way television worked definitely reflected the Goldenson ABC vision.
Right, because the Sarnoff image, if you will, is really old radio. It was the big budget variety shows, which kind of faded out. The Paley version was kind of, sitcoms and winds up being the rural sitcoms of the early 60s, the Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, Petticoat Junction, and so forth. ABC is closer to the modern version, in which you have a lot of films or like films or things like that, and appealing to the younger people and so forth and so on. And they are the three founders wind up kind of fading from the scene in the order that they were born. Sarnoff kind of leaves, retires in the mid-60s, hangs around till the early 70s in an honorary position, tried to pass off the company to his son Robert when that didn't really work. And NBC winds up getting bought out by who else? GE, who used to own NBC years ago. Bill Paley could never quite give up control. He tried to groom an heir apparent, and it never worked. He had a string of them who would be there for a while and then get tired of it and leave. And Sarnoff and Paley eventually dies, and the CBS is bought by Larry Tisch, another New York investor, and CBS winds up getting purchased by Westinghouse. ABC and Goldenson was the only one who really kind of saw the exit strategy. He was still running ABC in the mid-'80s. He could see that the TV world was changing and that they needed deeper pockets to be able to compete with the new media landscape. So he arranges for ABC to be bought by Capital Cities, which is a group of radio and TV stations. And they bought ABC in the mid-'80s, and within a year or so, as I say, both CBS and NBC had changed hands. And then he developed some young executives who wind up becoming very important. He was the one behind hiring Barry Diller, who pushed made-for-TV movies, Movies of the Week. Michael Eisner, who was hired by Diller, who follows Diller around and then winds up taking over the Disney company. And sure, by the mid-'90s, Disney buys ABC, and the circle is complete, and that's where things are now.
So that's where we are now, and we are open to any questions you all might have.
You're on mute, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I can say that we have so many questions. Hopefully we will get to a lot of them. Hopefully we can have you back at some point to continue the story. Because there's so many questions, I'm going to try and group some of them together. The first talks about their Jewishness. Why do you think that so many Jews entered the TV business? Did they face discrimination? Did them being Jewish, did that have an impact on some of the programs that they developed and who they hired? And then the last question for that was, with so many Jews on television, do you have any reason to think why Jews have suffered so much anti-Semitism when they're such part of the culture on television?
Can I jump the first part and then hand it over to Harry? One of the things that he and I have noticed as we were reviewing the series is use Jack Benny as an example. I watched Jack Benny faithfully week after week on TV, listening to radio shows. I didn't realize he was Jewish until actually doing some research. So that is there were definitely ethnic comedies, ethnic identities, especially in early radio. Then it kind of disappears a little, and then it comes back and starts to reemerge in the 70s. But basically, there was Jewishness in everything but explicit Jewishness. Famously, if you ever watched the Dick Van Dyke Show, that's Carl Reiner's life. That's Carl Reiner's house. That's Carl Reiner's family. But it wasn't explicitly a Jewish family. It was just inspired by. You can take all the other parts of that question, Harry.
Thank you, Wally. That's kind of you. Those are very deep questions, which would take quite a while to delve into. But I will say that, you look at Hollywood, you look at radio and TV in the early days, even though the Jews there's a lot of Jewish people behind the scenes in control or in positions of creative control, that was downplayed. It was always the fear of being too Jewish. And they were afraid that it was going to turn off a good chunk of the audience. And so you had, as Wally said, you look at a Dick Van Dyke Show where there are, the only Jew there, I think, was Maury Amsterdam.
Who gets bar mitzvahed in one of the
who gets bar mitzvahed in the show. That's true. And Carl Reiner had a bit part as Alan Brady. But my favorite is even as late as Seinfeld. You look at like George Costanza. With a name like George Costanza, it doesn't sound like he's Jewish, but if George Costanza isn't Jewish, I don't know who is Jewish. There was a feeling for many, many years that you did not want to parade Jewishness in front of people. Look at Bill Paley's life. I mean, he married two different women, both of whom were not Jewish, both of whom were from high society backgrounds. And Paley, despite that, Paley was still blackballed from a fancy golf course, despite all that. But Paley was trying to work in a different level. He was not trying to come across as the immigrant who's made his way up like David Sarnoff. So yeah, people were deliberately kind of keeping the Jewishness at least cloaked, let's put it that way. And then eventually when you get into the 70s and 80s, then that changes.
And I'm assuming is that also the answer for why the networks had Christmas specials, but not specials for Hanukkah?
I'm telling you something. My daughter was born in 1990, and I was so happy when the Rugrats came out with the Rugrats Hanukkah special or Passover special. I think they did both. I mean, this was like, thank you. You never saw that. And of course, that's all you saw was Charlie Brown's Christmas and, the Christmas operas and things like that, which is, it's fine. It's wonderful. But they just were not going to be doing a lot of Hanukkah shows. I don't think there was ever a Purim show on TV.
And I remember one songwriter saying, well, those sell. So we're going to be writing those songs because they sell and sell very well.
After all, who wrote White Christmas? Irving Berlin.
Right. A few people would like to know, when did soap operas come to be, as well as the local, or not the local, the evening news? Like we all think of the heyday of Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, and Peter Jennings. What preceded all of that?
Well, you can take soaps.
Well, you have to go the soap opera part. I mean, the Goldbergs was a soap opera. It was 5 days a week, 15 minutes. If you look at the radio ratings.
On the radio.
On the radio, I'm sorry. On the radio, yes. And of course, soap operas were very big in radio because they were reinforcing that daily connection with the housewives. I mean, they were soap operas for a good reason. I mean, they were doing household products. They were doing soap ads and all. And so that was an efficient way of storytelling. Most of them were about 15 minutes on radio. And then they made the transition to television, at first at 15, then 30, eventually hitting like 90 minutes. Soap operas, in a way, are perfect television. The story never ends.
And it is perfect product marketing. because they knew who was buying cleaning products, certainly back in the 50s. And they're targeting it directly to them. And it worked perfectly until, society changed.
Mm-hmm.
As to the news, again, all the networks started with 15 minutes of newscasts at the end of the 40s. And then it's not until the early 60s, in September, is it September or November? Yeah, September 63, CBS expands Walter Cronkite to 30 minutes, opening with an interview with President Kennedy, who of course winds up being killed a few months later. NBC had Huntley and Brinkley. They expand to 30 minutes soon thereafter. ABC was always playing catch up with CBS and NBC for years and years and years until the mid-70s. They had a 15-minute newscast with Peter Jennings, which I remember for a long time. Eventually, they go to 30 minutes, and that's where the network news really got going.
Mm-hmm.
And one more footnote on that, Harry, you were mentioning about when Bill Paley was looking at what could CBS do to separate itself from NBC back in the radio days, and basically he went where they weren't, and CBS really built a strong news organization, because while NBC might have done news, it was more commentary. It was, well, here's what's happening and here's my opinion. So it was commentary, and CBS actually went out into the field and delivered the news.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the future of TV is? Do you think we will continue with ABC, NBC, CBS, etc., or do you think we're going more of the path of Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, all the pay TV subscriptions?
Okay, so
well,
that's a
you're the
softball to
professor.
me.
You're the professor of future of television. So
Since this semester, I'm teaching a course called Future TV. And one of the first assignments, first major essay assignments for the students, is they have to choose from a list of video providers and just simply explain the business, explain the company. And in the old days, like 10 years ago, that might have been a pretty limited list led by, oh boy, who's going to get ABC? Who's going to get CBS? Now, I can't give those away, because there's like 30 different, including ABC, CBS, NBC, there's like 30 different sources of video entertainment, video news. And yes, that includes getting it through different streaming devices and services. And here's the key, though, is that all of them need something to sell. And so it's no coincidence that CBS, in developing its all access channel, soon to be, I believe, renamed the Paramount streaming. Paramount Plus, to go with like Disney Plus. So the quote at the time was, I don't care how you watch it. Watch it over the air, watch it on cable, watch it streaming, just watch it. And that's what they're in the business of, is creating content that could be multi-platformed and multi-purposed. And to this day, the established networks still have a slight leg up on that, in that they're the ones who have the local news. They're the ones that have the local presence in a community. And the more that the streaming starts to chip and become synonymous with that, that's when you're going to see some change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other than Gertrude Berg, were there other women involved in the higher management and development of TV?
That's a good question.
Honestly, there weren't too many. I mean, but that was the case in many things back then. I mean, I do know that there were some. If you go to old network radio, Louise Fletcher, I believe, is a woman who, or am I confusing her with an actress? I'm not sure, but there's a woman who wrote Sorry, Wrong Number. And she turned out some fabulous radio scripts in the days of the classic days of old time radio. And she was an industry unto herself. there were another number of women in old-time radio who were regular performers who were always being used. When you hear the credits, you'd hear their names. Of course, some movie stars, like somebody just pointed out, Loretta Young. Of course, but they were. She had her own show and she was sort of in charge of it, and she did the introductions to the program. But so did, yes. So yes, Loretta Young, but a lot of other film stars did the same thing in the mid-50s.
Well, one thing I would jump in was Ida Lupina was one of the 4 stars in 4 Star Productions.
Yep.
And she was also a director. Lucille Fletcher is what someone helpfully offers, Harry.
Thank you. Thank you.
But Ida Lupina would be one of my favorites only because she was very good at the film noir style of directing. But yes, until you start advancing into the 70s, 80s, etc., where you get a Sherry Lansing and folks like that, yes, it's a different world. The ones that do end up connecting in the radio and then the very early television, it's almost like you didn't notice that it happened. In other words, it was so early. Gertrude Berg's a perfect example. I mean, you're talking 20s, early 30s. We haven't figured out the rules of what you can't do yet. And so she was able to come in and parlay that. And the same thing with TV. I mean, think about this. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz are producing partners. And they're the Bigfoots of original production. And one of the things I love about Lucy's, one of her last acts before she stepped away from hands-on activity in Desilu and all, was giving the green light to shows that were getting a little bit of pushback because these are going to be a little expensive to do. And those shows were Mission Impossible and Star Trek.
And so if you look at the end of the Star Treks, you will see it's a Desilu company.
Thank you. All right, we are quickly running out of time. So let me see if I can get 1 or 2 more questions in. What led up to All in the Family happening? And can there ever be a show like that again in this period of political correctness?
All in the Family, of course, was creation of a co-creation, I believe, of Norman Lear, who had been working in TV for a number of years. And again, CBS had been running with rural sitcoms and so forth during the 1960s. And they decided that that had gone on long enough. They needed to attract younger viewers. And so you start having like the Smothers Brothers and so forth. And All in the Family comes on in January 71. Nobody thought it was going to be a success. It winds up being a huge success, sets the pace for other shows, Maude, and so on and so forth. Could it be done today? Honestly, not on a big network like that, no.
But it could be done, and that's where the multiple sources of video become more and more important, in that you can have that as your own special niche, which may then eventually get picked up into a wider audience platform or not. It becomes less important for that to happen. And one last footnote for All in the Family is it bounced around a number of years before Lear finally got it onto the CBS schedule.
Oh yeah, our book, Watching TV, The History of Television, describes in great detail how many times they had to reshoot the pilot and try to sell it to somebody else. ABC turned it down. It took a while to get it on the air.
Thank you. And where can people watch so many of these old shows, the ones that aren't forever in reruns, but the ones that people remember from the early days of TV?
It's a tricky proposition. Let's take, it's implied you mean watch them legally. And so then that's where the streaming world has come in handy, in that there are a number of services that are devoted to usually a particular niche that have a following that makes it worthwhile for someone to get the rights to legally stream them. Otherwise, what is striking is plain old-fashioned over-the-air or carried up by cable. There are multiple services. There'd be like Antenna, Cozy, multiple things from the Weigel Broadcasting decades and MeTV and such. And the reason I mention that is if you decided to pretend nothing else was going on in the world except your favorite Westerns, I could point you to a couple of channels where you can have all Westerns all the time and don't think the world has changed one iota since 1961.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been such a fun hour. I am sorry we could not get to all of the questions. We'd love to have you both back for a part 2 at some point. I want to thank you both, Harry and Walter, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I want to remind everybody next week to register for our program with historian E.M. Rose, where she will talk about the origins of the blood libel. And if you have enjoyed today's program, we ask that you go to Moment's website at momentmag.com, and please consider making a donation to help us support these types of programs in the future. Thank you both again, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.